Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The house on Birchwood Lane had a blue front door. That's the first thing I always remembered about it, not the sprawling oak tree in the backyard, not the way the kitchen smelled like cinnamon every Sunday morning, not even the crayon drawings my mother had inexplicably kept on the inside of the pantry door for 23 years. No, the blue front door. My father had painted it himself the summer I turned 6, and I had stood beside him on that muggy July afternoon handing him brushes I was too small to use, convinced I was the most helpful person alive. For as long as I could remember, 14 Birchwood Lane was home. Not just a house home, the kind of place that lives inside your chest that you carry around with you like a second heartbeat. My parents had bought it the year before I was born, stretching every dollar they had, and they'd raised two daughters inside its walls. Me, Nadia, the oldest by 4 years, and then Renata, my younger sister, who came into the world already knowing how to make everything about herself. I don't say that with cruelty. I say it because it's simply true, the way some facts about people are just facts. Renata was magnetic and dramatic and effortlessly lovable in that specific way some people are born into. She cried prettier than everyone else. She laughed louder. And our parents, without ever meaning to, had spent 30 years orbiting her like two devoted moons. I had accepted this about my family the way you accept weather. You don't like every storm, but you learn to dress for it. When I was 28, I moved back home. It wasn't the plan. The plan had been New York, a career in graphic design, a tiny apartment I could call mine. And for 4 years, that's exactly what I had. Then the agency I worked for folded in a spectacular, public, humiliating fashion, 30 people out of jobs in a single Friday afternoon email. My savings were modest. My lease was up in 6 weeks. And my mother, in her particular way of making generosity sound like a mild suggestion, said, "Well, your old room is just sitting there." So I came home. I told myself it was temporary. 6 months, maybe 8. I'd freelance, rebuild, save aggressively, and leave again. What I didn't account for was Renata. Renata was 24 at the time, still living at home, working part-time at a boutique downtown, spending the rest of her hours redecorating her bedroom and cultivating a social life that seemed to require an enormous amount of parental funding. She and I had always maintained a careful, polite distance, the kind of sibling relationship that functions perfectly as long as you don't actually share space. Sharing space turned out to be the problem. For the first year, things were fine, strained at moments but fine. I worked from the second bedroom, kept my hours, contributed to groceries, and tried to be invisible in the way that guests in other people's homes learn to be, because that's what it felt like being a guest. My mother had repainted my old room a color I hated. Renata's fingerprints were on everything, the Netflix queue, the bathroom cabinet, the dinner conversation, but I kept quiet. I was saving money. I was rebuilding. I had a plan then. 14 months after I moved in, Renata decided she wanted my room. I should explain, I was in the larger of the two secondary bedrooms. Renata had the smaller one, which she had always had and which she now decided was insufficient for the vision she had for her life. She wanted more space for a home studio, she said. She was going to start a content creation business. She needed natural light, she needed room, she needed my room. I remember the evening my parents brought it up. We were at dinner, my mother's pot roast, the good kind she only made when she wanted the atmosphere to feel soft. My father cleared his throat in the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been practicing. And then, gently, with the careful choreography of two people who had discussed this extensively without me, they suggested that perhaps I might consider moving into Renata's smaller room. Just for now, my mother said. It would really help her get started, my father said. I looked at them both across the pot roast and understood with perfect clarity that this had already been decided. I said I'd think about it. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed I'd had since I was 12, which was still there, which was one of the few things that still felt like mine, and I thought about it for approximately 45 minutes before I realized there was nothing to think about. The answer they wanted was yes. Any other answer would become a months-long grievance. I was a guest. Guests don't argue about room assignments. I moved into Renata's old room the following weekend. It was smaller than I remembered. It got no afternoon light. The closet had a broken rod that nobody had fixed in years. Renata, meanwhile, transformed my old room in under 3 weeks. New furniture, ring lights, a backdrop wall in terracotta and cream. She posted the process on Instagram with a caption about investing in yourself and your dreams. It got 400 likes. I got a broken closet rod. 6 months later, my parents sat me down again. This time, there was no pot roast. My father did most of the talking. The house, he explained, had become something of a financial burden. He was 61, my mother was 58. They had been thinking about downsizing for a while. This was news to me, and had found a lovely two-bedroom condo 40 minutes away near my uncle's family. Quieter, easier to maintain, more appropriate for the next chapter of their lives. The house, he said, was going to be sold. I nodded slowly. I asked when they were thinking. Renata, it turned out, was moving in with her boyfriend, a man named Cole who I had met twice and who seemed to sustain himself entirely on confidence and protein powder. They were getting an apartment. They had a timeline. My parents were moving when Renata moved. The timeline they handed me was 90 days. I had 90 days to find somewhere else to go. I want to be precise about something. They didn't ask me to leave. They didn't sit across from me with coldness or hostility. They explained everything reasonably, with love even in the gentle tones of people who have convinced themselves that a thing is fair because they feel bad about it. But the math was simple. Renata had a plan and I was not in it. The house was being sold around me like a stage being struck while I was still standing on it. I drove home from a client meeting that evening and sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the blue front door. I thought about being 6 years old handing my father brushes. Then I went inside and started making calls. Here is what nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family. The skills are quietly extraordinary. I had spent 2 years back in that house living as small as I could, freelancing steadily, spending almost nothing, sending money to a savings account I treated like a bruise I wasn't allowed to touch. I had no social life to speak of. I drove a 7-year-old car. I bought store brand everything. I had done all of this dutifully without complaint while telling myself it was temporary, while watching my sister's ring light glow seep under the wall between our rooms at night. I had, it turned out, saved a great deal of money. The first call I made was to a mortgage broker I'd consulted once 2 years prior before everything had gone sideways. He remembered me. We talked for an hour. The second call was to a real estate attorney. The third was to a property appraiser I found through a mutual contact, a methodical woman named Gretchen who wore reading glasses on a chain and did not waste words. And then I waited. I waited and I watched and I let my parents list the house. The listing went up on a Tuesday in early March. I had known it was coming, I had known for weeks, had been tracking every piece of the process the way you track a storm on radar, and when the photographs appeared online that afternoon I looked at them for a long time. The blue door, the oak tree, the kitchen where every Sunday had smelled like cinnamon, the pantry where my crayon drawings were presumably still hiding on the inside of the door. The asking price was reasonable, slightly below what I had estimated actually. My parents, I suspected, wanted a quick sale. I submitted an offer 4 days after listing through my attorney under an LLC I had set up the month before, a clean offer, strong, no contingencies that weren't standard. My agent presented it without theatrics. My parents accepted within 48 hours. They did not know it was me. I want to be honest about the morality of this moment because I've sat with it since. Was it deceptive? Yes, technically. Was it manipulative? I've turned that word over many times. I didn't forge anything. I didn't lie on any document. I submitted a legal offer for a property that was for sale through proper channels and it was accepted. The fact that I obscured my identity through an LLC is not unusual in real estate. People do it constantly, for all kinds of reasons. I did it because I knew with bone-deep certainty that if my parents saw my name on that offer they would refuse it. Not because it was a bad offer. Because it would have made things complicated in the way families make things complicated, and they were not people who knew how to sit with complicated. They would have chosen clean over fair, and I had made my peace with that. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I told them 2 weeks before. I didn't plan the conversation as carefully as I probably should have. I drove over on a Sunday afternoon. They were still in the house, finishing packing, navigating the particular melancholy of dismantling a life, and my mother made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table one more time. I said, "I need to tell you something about the sale." I watched my mother's face while I explained. She went through several expressions quickly. Confusion first, then a strange concentrated effort to understand, then something that looked almost like the beginning of anger before it crumpled into something harder to name. My father was very quiet for a long time, then he said, "That was you." A question, just the slow arrival of a fact. "That was me," I said. What followed was not a fight exactly. My mother cried, which I had expected. My father said some things about trust that stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I said some things in return, about the room, about the 90 days, about the years of quietly coming second, about the blue front door and the way I had never quite been able to leave this place alone in my chest. I said them without anger, which surprised me. I had spent months preparing for this conversation as a battle, and it turned out to be something else entirely, something rower and sadder and more like grief than victory. At some point my mother said, "We didn't know it was so hard for you." And I thought, I know, that's the whole story. I moved into 14 Birchwood Lane on a Friday in May. The movers brought my things in through the blue front door, which I had touched the morning of closing like a person completing a long walk. The oak tree in the backyard had budded early that year, fat with new growth. The kitchen needed new appliances, which I had budgeted for. The small bedroom, Renata's old room, the one I'd been moved into, the one with no afternoon light, I made into a studio for myself, properly this time, with good shelving and a desk I'd been wanting for years. The first thing I unpacked was a photograph of my father painting the front door blue. I'm standing next to him in the picture, grinning, holding a paintbrush too big for my hand. My aunt had taken it. I'd found the photo in a box in my apartment years ago and kept it, the way you keep things you can't explain needing. I hung it in the kitchen, where the crayon drawings still lived on the inside of the pantry door. My parents and I have found our way back to each other slowly, in the way families do when they're willing to be honest about the distance. It took longer with my mother. My father came around first, called me on a Tuesday night in July, said he'd been thinking about it, said he understood more than he'd let on at first, said he was proud of me actually in his careful way. That one I held on to, Renata and I don't speak much. That's not a wound anymore, just a shape things have taken. There are Sunday mornings now when I make cinnamon rolls from a recipe I found in my mother's handwriting, tucked in a kitchen drawer I was clearing out. The house fills up with that smell and I stand in it for a little while before I do anything else. The blue front door faces east in the mornings, it catches the light. Sometimes the only way to stay is to leave first and come back on your own terms.